March 14, 1945, eastern France, the Vosges Mountains. The fog came first, then the sound, a low, grinding hum that rolled down the valley like distant thunder. Staff Sergeant Daniel Corwin pressed himself flat against the frozen earth, fingers gripping the wooden stock of his M1 Garand. Around him, the rest of his platoon did the same. 32 men, infantry, 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment. They had been holding this stretch of wooded hillside for 6 days. The sound grew louder. Corwin had heard it before. Every man in the platoon had. It was the sound of a Panther tank, 60 tons of German steel, moving through the fog like a predator that didn't need to see to kill. He turned his head slowly, scanning the tree line. The morning light was pale, filtered through mist and the skeletal branches of ash trees. Snow clung to the ground in patches. Somewhere to his left, Private Elias Gray was breathing too fast. Corwin caught his eye and raised a hand. "Steady." The kid nodded, but his knuckles were white on his rifle. The Panther broke through the fog at 200 yards. It emerged from the ridgeline road like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. Low profile, sloped armor. The 75mm gun barrel swung left, then right, scanning for targets. Behind it, 3 more shapes began to materialize. A column, 4 Panthers, moving slow, methodical, unstoppable. Corwin cursed under his breath. They had no anti-tank support, no bazookas, no artillery. The regiment had been stretched thin across the Vosges front, and supply lines were strained. The platoon had 2 Springfield rifles with armor-piercing rounds. That was it. Against a Panther, they might as well have been throwing stones. The lead tank stopped. Its turret rotated. The barrel lifted slightly, adjusting elevation. Corwin knew what was coming. He pressed his face into the dirt and shouted the only word that mattered. "Down!" The shot cracked through the valley like the sky splitting open. The shell hit a tree 50 feet behind them, and the trunk exploded into splinters. The concussion rolled over the platoon like a physical force. Men pressed tighter against the earth. Someone was praying. Someone else was swearing. The Panther fired again. This time the shell hit closer. Dirt and snow erupted in a fountain of black smoke. Corwin felt the heat on his back. His ears rang. He turned his head and saw Private Gray staring at him, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. "Stay down!" Corwin shouted, but the words felt like they came from someone else's mouth. The Panthers began to advance again, slow, deliberate. The treads chewed through the frozen ground, leaving deep scars in the earth. The fog parted around them like curtains. Corwin could see the commanders now, heads visible in the open hatches, scanning the hillside with binoculars. He looked back at his men. 32 faces, most of them younger than 25. Most of them had never seen a Panther up close. Most of them wouldn't survive if the column reached the tree line. The lead tank was 100 yards away. Corwin pressed his forehead against the cold ground and thought about everything he'd learned in 3 years of war. He thought about the technical manuals, the intelligence briefings, the after-action reports. He thought about the dozen different ways men had tried to stop these machines. None of them had worked. Not here, not without proper weapons. The Panther fired a 3rd time, and the world turned white. The platoon had lost 11 men in 2 weeks. Not to machine guns, not to mortars, not to snipers or artillery or disease or any of the 1,000 other ways a man could die in war. They had lost 11 men to tanks, specifically to Panthers. The German Panzer IV, a 50-ton fortress on treads, armed with a cannon that could punch through American armor at 1,000 yards, and frontal plating so thick that even a direct hit from a 76mm Sherman gun would ricochet off like rain. Corwin had watched it happen. 4 days earlier, a single Panther had rolled through their forward observation post at dawn. The platoon had been dug in along a ridgeline, camouflaged, silent, waiting for a supply convoy that never came. The tank appeared without warning, moving through the fog with its engine barely audible. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already firing. The first shell killed 3 men in a foxhole. The explosion was so precise, so surgically devastating, that the rest of the platoon didn't even have time to react. The second shell hit a machine gun nest. The third destroyed their radio. The fourth killed the lieutenant. The Panther never stopped moving. It rolled past their positions, turret swiveling, firing methodically into every concealed spot along the ridge. The crew inside never exposed themselves, never made a mistake. When it finally disappeared back into the fog, it left behind a smoking crater where the observation post had been, and 11 bodies that couldn't be recovered until nightfall. Corwin had survived by luck. He had been 20 feet away from the foxhole when the first shell hit, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to be buried under dirt and debris, close enough to hear the screams. He spent that night in a field hospital, covered in bruises and temporary deafness, while a medic with tired eyes cleaned the cuts on his face and told him he was lucky. Lucky. Corwin didn't feel lucky. He felt angry. He returned to the platoon the next morning and found them dug in along a new position, quieter than before, faces blank with exhaustion. Private Gray sat against a tree, staring at his hands. Sergeant Mullins was cleaning his rifle with the kind of focus that came from not wanting to think. No one spoke about the lieutenant. No one spoke about the observation post. Corwin sat down next to Mullins and asked the only question that mattered. "How do we kill one?" Mullins didn't look up. "We don't. There has to be a way. You want to kill a Panther." Mullins finally met his eyes. "You get a Sherman, or a Hellcat, or you call in air support, or you mine the road and hope they're stupid enough to drive over it. But we don't have any of those things, so we don't kill Panthers. We hide from them and hope they don't see us." Corwin stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the edge of the camp. The Vosges Mountains stretched out before him, dark and silent under the overcast sky. Somewhere out there, the Panthers were still moving, still hunting, still untouchable. He thought about the technical briefings he'd sat through back in training. He thought about the diagrams of German armor. He thought about weak points, vision slits, engine grills, turret rings. But all of those weak points required getting close, too close, close enough to die. Corwin turned and walked back to the platoon. He sat down and pulled out his field notebook. He began to sketch. Tank, frontal armor, too thick. Side armor, still too thick. Rear armor, better, but impossible to reach. Turret, rotating, protected. Tracks, vulnerable, but covered by infantry. Engine compartment, armored grille. He stared at the sketch for a long time. Then he drew something else, something small, something simple, a magnet. Corwin didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of the dugout, back against the dirt wall, field notebook open on his lap. Around him, the platoon slept in shifts. Mullins snored softly. Private Gray muttered in his sleep. The air smelled like wet earth and cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. Corwin stared at his sketch and thought the problem was simple. A Panther tank was a sealed fortress, frontal armor, 80 millimeters of sloped steel, side armor, 50 millimeters, rear armor, 40. The turret was protected by 100 millimeters at the front. The tracks were vulnerable, but knocking out a track didn't kill the crew. It just immobilized the tank, and an immobilized Panther could still fire its cannon. What he needed was something that could get inside. He turned the page and began to write. Not sentences, just fragments, technical notes, observations, things he'd seen, things he'd read, magnetic mines, used by saboteurs, attached to steel surfaces, detonated remotely or on a timer. He'd seen a demonstration once, back in training. A British commando had shown them a limpet mine, a cylindrical explosive with magnets on one side, designed to stick to the hull of a ship. Simple, effective, deadly, But limpet mines were heavy and rare, and the platoon didn't have any. Corwin tapped his pencil against the paper and thought about alternatives. Grenades, standard issue. Every man in the platoon carried at least 2 Mika-2 fragmentation grenades, pineapple-shaped, 4-second fuse, effective radius, 15 feet, lethal radius, 5. But a grenade wouldn't stick to a tank. It would just bounce off and explode on the ground. Useless, unless... Corwin sat up straighter, unless you made it stick. He flipped to a new page and began to sketch again. Grenade, fuse, body, pin. Now add magnet, strong enough to hold the grenade in place. Positioned on the tank's surface, close to a vulnerable point. Engine grill, vision slit, turret ring. The fuse would burn. The grenade would detonate. The explosion would drive shrapnel inward, through the weak point, into the crew compartment. It wouldn't destroy the tank, but it didn't need to. It just needed to kill the men inside. Corwin stared at the sketch for a long time. Then he stood up and walked out of the dugout. The night was cold and clear. Stars stretched across the sky in pale constellations. The camp was quiet except for the sound of distant artillery, a low rumble that never quite stopped. Corwin walked to the supply tent and pushed aside the canvas flap. Inside, crates were stacked against the walls. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, tools. He scanned the inventory list pinned to the wooden post and found what he was looking for. Magnets, used for field repairs, salvaged from destroyed vehicles, collected from abandoned German equipment. There were 6 of them in a wooden crate near the back of the tent, each one about the size of a man's palm, flat, heavy, strong enough to hold 20 pounds of steel. Corwin picked one up and felt its weight. Then he slipped it into his jacket pocket and walked back to the dugout. He sat down in his corner and pulled out the magnet. He placed it on the ground next to a Mk2 grenade. He stared at both objects for a long time. Then he began to work. March 16th, 1945. Dawn. The fog was thicker this morning. It rolled down the valley in waves, swallowing the trees and the ridgeline and the road below. Visibility, 50 yards, maybe less. Corwin crouched at the edge of the tree line, hands wrapped around the modified grenade, and waited. He had spent 2 days preparing, 2 days of careful, secretive work in the back of the supply tent, away from the eyes of the platoon. 2 days of testing magnets, adjusting weight distribution, wrapping the grenade body with cloth to muffle sound. He had used wire to secure the magnet to the base of the grenade, positioning it so the explosive force would direct upward and inward when detonated. It was crude, improvised, probably illegal under some military regulation he'd never read, but it might work. The sound came first. That low, grinding hum. Corwin's pulse quickened. He turned and looked back at the rest of the platoon. Mullins was 10 feet away, rifle ready, eyes on the road. Private Gray was behind a fallen log, breathing fast again. The rest of the men were spread out along the tree line, silent and invisible in the fog. Corwin had told them the plan. Most of them thought he was insane. Mullins had said it outright, but no one had a better idea. And no one wanted to sit and wait for another Panther to roll through their position and kill them one by one. So they waited. The Panther appeared at 70 yards. It came out of the fog like a ghost, moving slowly, turret scanning left and right. No infantry support, no other tanks, just one Panther, alone, rolling down the valley road on a routine patrol. Corwin felt his mouth go dry. He looked down at the grenade in his hands. The magnet was secure. The pin was in place. The fuse was ready. All he had to do was get close, 50 feet. That was the goal. Close enough to throw, close enough to make sure the magnet made contact, close enough to die if anything went wrong. The Panther rolled forward. 40 yards now. The engine noise filled the valley. Corwin could see the commander in the open hatch, scanning the tree line with binoculars. He could see the barrel of the 75mm gun, black and enormous, swiveling slowly. 30 yards. Corwin stood up. He moved fast, low, keeping to the shadows at the edge of the fog. His boots made no sound on the frozen ground. His breathing was shallow. His hands were steady. He had done this 1,000 times in his mind. Every step, every movement, every angle. 20 yards. The Panther's engine roared. The treads chewed through the dirt. The commander was still scanning, still searching. Corwin reached the edge of the road and dropped to one knee behind a fallen tree. He pulled the pin from the grenade. The safety lever pinged away into the fog. 4 seconds. He stood and threw. The grenade arced through the air, spinning, trailing the faint whisper of burning fuse. It struck the rear of the tank just above the engine grill. The magnet made contact with a dull clang. The grenade stuck. Corwin dropped flat. The explosion was sharp and focused, not the wide, scattering blast of a standard fragmentation grenade. This was concentrated, directional. The shrapnel drove inward through the engine grill, tearing into the fuel lines and the compartment beyond. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Panther's engine coughed. Black smoke poured from the grill. The tank lurched forward, treads grinding, and then stopped. The turret began to rotate, faster now, desperate, searching for the source of the attack. Corwin stayed flat against the ground. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. The smoke thickened. Flames licked out from the engine compartment. The commander shouted something in German. The hatch opened wider. 2 men began to climb out. Mullins fired first. A single shot from his rifle. The first crewman dropped. Gray fired next. The second man fell back into the hatch. The flames spread. The Panther's ammunition cooked off with a deep, rolling boom that shook the ground, and then it was over. The tank sat motionless on the road, burning, smoke rising into the fog. No movement, no sound, just the crackle of flames and the smell of burning fuel. Corwin stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. He looked down at the road and saw the Panther's silhouette disappearing into the smoke. Mullins appeared next to him, breathing hard. Did that just work? Corwin didn't answer. He just stared at the burning tank and felt something cold settle in his chest. It had worked. March 22nd, 1945. Regimental headquarters, 30 miles west of the Vosges front. Major William Hatcher sat behind a field desk, reading the after-action report for the 3rd time. He was a thin man with deep lines around his eyes and the kind of exhaustion that came from 2 years of continuous command. He set the report down and looked up at Staff Sergeant Daniel Corwin, who stood at attention in front of the desk. "You attached a magnet to a grenade," Hatcher said. "Yes, sir." "And you threw it at a Panther tank." "Yes, sir." "And it worked." "Yes, sir." Hatcher leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated?" Corwin didn't answer. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. Hatcher sighed. "Improvised explosives, unauthorized modifications to standard ordnance, failure to report experimental weapons to your commanding officer. I could have you court-martialed." "Yes, sir, but I won't." Hatcher picked up the report again. "Because this is the first time in 6 months that anyone in this regiment has successfully disabled a Panther without air support or armor backup, and because 11 men died in your platoon 2 weeks ago, and you decided to do something about it." He stood up and walked to the map pinned to the wall. Red marks indicated enemy positions. Blue marks indicated Allied advances. The Vosges front was a jagged line of contested territory, slow and brutal. "How many magnets do you have?" Hatcher asked. 6, sir, salvaged from the supply depot." "And how many grenades?" "Enough." Hatcher turned and looked at him. Can you teach this to other men?" Corwin hesitated. "It's not complicated, sir. Just wire, magnets, and timing. Then you'll report to the training officer tomorrow morning. You'll demonstrate the technique to every infantry squad in the battalion. We'll issue magnets as standard equipment. We'll add the modification to the field manual." Hatcher paused. "Unofficially, of course." "Yes, sir." Hatcher walked back to the desk and sat down. He picked up a pen and signed the bottom of the report. "Dismissed, Sergeant." Corwin saluted and turned to leave. "Corwin." He stopped. Hatcher looked up. "The men who died in your platoon, do you remember their names?" "Yes, sir, all of them." Hatcher nodded slowly. "Good. Don't forget." Corwin left the headquarters tent and stepped out into the cold afternoon light. Around him, the camp was alive with movement, trucks rolling in with supplies, soldiers cleaning weapons, medics setting up tents. The war continued. It always did. But something had changed. Over the next 4 weeks, Corwin's magnetic grenade modifications spread through the regiment, then the division, then the corps. It was never officially recognized, never given a designation or a proper name. Men just started calling it the magnet trick. Some called it the Corwin bomb. Others didn't call it anything at all. They just used it. Reports began to filter back. A Panther disabled near Strasbourg. Another one immobilized outside Colmar. 3 more destroyed in the Saar Valley. The technique wasn't perfect. It required courage. It required getting close. It required luck. But it worked. By the end of April, the German armored divisions were retreating. The Vosges front collapsed. The war in Europe moved into its final weeks. And somewhere in the chaos, in the after-action reports and the casualty lists and the scattered field notes, a single line appeared. Improvised magnetic explosive device, effective against rear armor. Recommend further testing. It was signed by Major William Hatcher, filed on April 30th, 1945. 1 week before the German surrender, Corwin never saw the report. He was already in Bavaria by then, moving with his platoon through the wreckage of a collapsing empire. He never received a medal, never gave an interview, never wrote a memoir. He just kept moving forward. Years later, in a dusty archive in Washington, a military historian would find a single photograph, black and white, slightly out of focus. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a burned-out Panther tank. One of them was holding a grenade with something attached to the base, something small and square. The caption read, "Unidentified Infantry Unit, Vosges Region, March 1945. No names, no explanations, just a moment, frozen in silver and shadow." The historian would file the photograph away and move on to the next box, and the story would remain where it had always been, in the fog, in the cold, in the silence between the sound of treads and the sound of fire, waiting to be remembered.